am George Knapp, listening to that UFO podcast and having one hell of a good time.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and I'm delighted to be joined by two former guests on the podcast. They have their own stories to tell, and they are both covered in detail on previous episodes, so make sure you do check those out. We have James Iandoli, host of the wonderful Engaging the Phenomenon YouTube channel, and J. Christopher King, who is co-founder of the Experiencer Group and regular co-host of Witness Citizen now with Sean Rash as well. Gentlemen, welcome both to the podcast.
Hey. Absolutely great. Hey, it's absolutely fantastic to be back, Andy. I love your show, and I'm so happy to be here on such a great occasion. It's awesome.
Thank you. And James, I'm sure you echo those sentiments, yeah?
Totally. Obviously, I love that UFO podcast. It's great being able to talk to you face to face again, digitally.
Yes.
So, thanks so much for having us.
Well, listen, I'm only disappointed that I can't be at this event, and I won't lie, there were times I checked flights, but just with life and all that kind of stuff, and my wife giving me a kind of unapproving eye, and my passport being out of date, that I won't be able to make it. But the event you're putting on, we're going to discuss in detail, is an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon. Link for that will be in the description. It is an in-person and virtual event with limited tickets on both fronts. And that's on October 8th this year in New York City, my favorite place in the world. And that's at the Helen Mills Theatre. I'm going to just run through the guests very quickly because it's quite the lineup. And I would say that a lot of lineups who lost Ralph Blumenthal as a guest would struggle to fill that void, but I think it's stellar with the replacements as well. So you've got Dr.Garry Nolan, Mitch Horowitz, Dr. Sean Esbjorn-Hargens, Darren from Exo Academian, and Dr. Tim Grieve-Carlson, hosted by James and Jay yourselves, but also Priscilla Stone of Quantum Witch Cafe and also the Anomalous Podcast Network, and Kelly Chase of the wonderful UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. And we're going to dig into those guests very soon. But first off, I want to ask you, how did the conference even come about? What was that spark of inspiration? Who's best to start off this story?
I could start. Yeah, I mean, you can say the genesis of this was with what me and Jay, jokingly, not jokingly call, New York City UFO Supper Club. And, Jay and I being, we live in the same kind of area, generally speaking. And we started meeting together for, dinners in New York City with, between ourselves and other researchers and experiencers. And we're having amazing conversations, right? Really deep conversations. And so that's kind of how we started getting together. And, actually Jay had mentioned it to me, like, what do you think about doing a conference? And the funny thing about that is like for several weeks, I was like thinking like, man, we should, me and Jay and the UFO Supper Club, we should do some kind of an event. But I have to admit, Jay's vision was much greater. I was just thinking like we can do a small thing for like 2 hours with us or maybe some other people. But it really took on a life of its own. And we decided to just do it. Jay, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, as James was mentioning, we had been kind of getting together regularly in person about once a month, either just by ourselves or with people that happen to be visiting town. It's, both UFO Supper Club in New York City and this conference, it's taking advantage a little bit of the fact that New York City is such a nexus point for people, and that people are coming through town all the time. And so being able to take advantage of those opportunities to be able to bring people together has been already something that James and I have found really wonderful and engaging, and just a fantastic experience to do. So why not take that situation that we've been dealing with together and then bring it into the wider community? And so, yeah, I guess it was like, UFO Supper Club 3 or 4 or something like that, or just after, where we started talking about, hey, maybe we should throw an event together. That'd be amazing. One of the things here is that New York City never has conferences these days, like within this field. And it's such a dense area of the country. And the East Coast in general, like most of the US conferences happen out on the West Coast or the Southwest. And there's been scattered events, but it really has been since Bud Hopkins passed, for the most part, that there have been really active, kind of more intellectually driven conferences happening in or around New York City for the most part. And James and I would really, really like to change that. So this is an opportunity to take a solid step in that direction, for sure.
Even for someone like myself, clearly not based in the United States, since I started the podcast and getting to know people like yourselves and speaking to the wonderful guests that I have, I've looked at after COVID when the conferences have started back up. And like you say, the quickest place for me to fly to tends to be New York. It's the first stop on that East Coast. But like everything tends to be middle of the country, south, right over on that West Coast. And that just adds on hundreds and hundreds of pounds in additional accommodation. And it just makes it all that harder to get to. So like I say, if I had more notice, not blaming you gents, this is something that if it'd been a bit further down the line, I would have been like, yeah, I could make that, because you're expanding. It's not just a New York audience. You've got people who are Katie Howland is traveling from the UK over for this event as well. So you're opening up to an international market as well, aren't you?
Yeah, there are people coming from the UK. There are people coming from California. I know folks coming from Texas, Minnesota, Ohio, Maryland, all over. And, where there's a will, there's a way. And there's a hunger for, I think, in this kind of pandemic, post-pandemic, however you want to frame it, mindset, where people have been cooped up for so long, and people have had time during the pandemic to kind of look into whatever their fascinations have been. It's been a period of rerouting for a lot of people. Some people took up bread making. Some people got really into ufology, you know what I mean? And anomalous studies, and really kind of investing themselves in that. And so we recognize that there's a hunger for people to be able to meet up in person again, and being able to see each other again. And I think that it'll promote positivity probably within the field as well, because when you're able to kind of break bread with people, see people in person, engage with them physically, then it tends to shift the conversation, and people tend to have a better understanding of each other when they're able to get together. Wouldn't you say, James?
Yeah, totally. And another thing is that, minus the lack of events over here on the East Coast, the interest is incredibly high. It's not that the interest isn't here. It's just that people haven't took the initiative to put together events like this on the East Coast, and especially in New York City. And I think there's power in doing an event like this in the heart of New York City. Kind of like the message it sends out, and again, in a positive way. And I think that it's going to have a ripple effect, and hopefully it encourages other people to do, similar things here on the East Coast, because, as I jokingly say, I want UAP to be synonymous with NYC or vice versa. And I think it's totally doable. And, there's a lot of great researchers that are actually in the tri-state area over here by New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and the surrounding areas, and even DC. And, within driving distance of New York City, there's a ton of great researchers who can, participate in events like this.
Let me stay with you, James, on that one. What is your target audience for an event like this? Because not only is it face-to-face, there is also that virtual option, which is great for listeners on this who maybe can't reach NYC or are in the area but can't make it on the day. There's, of course, people who are going to buy tickets because they are interested in the UFO topic. They are researchers. They are just fans of ufology, if you want to call it that. But are you hoping for attention for an event like this outside of that UFO bubble?
In a sense, I would say that the event and kind of the vision and what we're doing Obviously not just the phenomenon, but we included and highlighted anomalous experiences. And so that's a very kind of broad stroke in one sense, because that could almost be anything that people would consider paranormal, right? And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I'm just, what people consider paranormal generally overlaps so much with the UFO phenomenon. And so what we're doing here is being inclusive, and also, and it's almost in a sense, I would say, leading edge, but it's more apparent now as part of the conversation post slide 9. So I'm talking about ATIP slide 9. Take a look at that, right? And you're going to be like, oh my God, that's like anomalous experiences type, material, or what people would call paranormal or the occult, the hitchhiker effect, all that, again, even maybe 5 or 6 years ago, people weren't generally tying together with UFOs and the phenomenon. Some people who are very deep into the research would have made those connections already. But we have a brand new wave and generation of researchers who are like, wow, the Tic Tac Nimitz, event, and you have what happened to Commander Fravor and everybody with the meeting at the Cat Point, and what somebody like John Alexander would call a sentient precognitive intelligence, right? And that actually is stuff we're including in this event, because that stuff actually falls into the anomalous experiences territory. And and just as a direct example, SAIC, the contractor company, they did a study with the CIA, and this was in The Secret Machines. It was highlighted in the Secret Machines book by Peter Levenda and Tom DeLonge. The title of the document is called Anomalous Mental Phenomena, right? And that's basically psychic phenomena, and anything that falls into the consciousness category. And again, after a slide 9 world, basically, I think it's apparent that that's, it's part of the conversation, not aside from it. What about you, Jay?
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the initial inspirations for kind of coming together with this is that we were talking about the Archives of the Impossible conference that was organized by Jeff Kripal down at Rice University and his GEM department, the department within religious studies and philosophy of Gnosticism, esotericism, and mysticism, which has been kind of like a hiding place for academics and intellectuals that have been very much driven by the humanities and social sciences based approach towards looking at the phenomenon or anomalous studies in general. And so looking at that wider framework seems really key, right? Because I think what I liked about that, and I don't mean to speak for you, James, but what we talked about prior is that kind of approach where you can build a bigger tent and create larger conversations, maybe we can stumble upon some greater truths through asking those bigger questions as a community that invites in other aspects of the phenomenon or other aspects that might be a little bit tricky for one subset of the community, right? And so and it's very natural to do such a thing. I mean, look at when we talk about the ATIP or articles in the New York Times, things like that, we're talking about Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. And Leslie herself, we just had dinner with her the other day, and she happens to be one of the people that outed the ATIP program and published those now incredibly world-famous cockpit videos. And at the same time, she wrote the book Surviving Death, which is much about the survival of consciousness, and was turned into a hit Netflix show last year. And she was also very close with Bud Hopkins, earlier in her life. And so when we think about these situations, we often think that, people have to be nuts and bolts. Often there's these considerations where you're either a ghost person or a nuts and bolts person or this or that. And it seems like we might be missing a bigger picture, and having the opportunity to invite in more academics, more scientists, more people with broader backgrounds, and be able to kind of provoke dialogue and conversation among those groups, we might be able to get a bigger picture in the near future, which would be great, right?
Yeah, and just really quick to add to what Jay was saying about the archives of the impossible. You know, if you think about the Invisible College and Esalen, which some people will be familiar with here, that a lot of these people in the background are deep into this stuff, are at having those kind of private conferences and private conversations. And this is almost like, in some way, a forward, a public conversation in that same regard, where because a lot of times they don't want to be criticized, they don't want their research being interfered with, but it's I think time for that conversation to be more public and open. I think that's something that we're doing with here.
Let's talk about that group that's going to be part of the event. Obviously, we've got kicking off. I'll start with the name, and then I'll let one of you come in, and we'll run through them. Dr.Garry Nolan, I think it's fair to say, is that the headline name, as wonderful as the speakers are, I don't think that's unfair. His star is currently shining very bright, not only in the world of interviews, newscasts. He's taken over as the face, I think, of the UFO movement currently, especially in the mainstream media. He speaks very well. He's very charismatic, and his appearance with Tucker Carlson not long ago certainly raised a lot of eyebrows as well in the general, I think, mainstream. He's a scientific voice leading the UFO movement now, as opposed to, I think he's replaced Luis Elizondo currently, or temporarily, who knows, who was the government, who had come out of the shadows, and I ran a program known as ATIP. And all those questions came in, and as Lewis kind of faded away for the time being for various reasons, Garry Nolan, as a scientist, has taken over that mantle. So if one of you wants to kick off, tell us a little bit about what Gary's going to bring to the conference and why it was important to get Garry involved.
Well, I think Dr. Nolan, or just to say, actually, he's a professor, so he's Professor Dr. Garry Nolan. So he has the mindset of a teacher, basically, which is an amazing thing regarding this topic. And the wonderful thing about Garry, I think, other than he's an academic, and Diana Pasulka had said, academics have a different approach to their work, rather than, say, the government or people with classifications where they can't really share. But academics want to share. They have to. They're mandated to share and show their work, so other people can share and peer review the information and contribute to it. But also, Gary's worked on the materials. He's done the analysis of those. He's done a peer-reviewed paper with Valet on that, and he's worked with experiencers. So, Dr. Garry Nolan and Dr. Kit Green, and I'm sure other people in the background have been doing, this research with experiencers. And I think it's fair to say publicly that Jim Semivan said he was even involved in that, along with many others. And they're doing cutting edge work. Whether you want to talk about the materials that they're analyzing. And obviously the technology that Dr. Nolan patented is like the only technology in the world that can do what it does, to take a closer look at both UFO materials and also experiencers. So I think, being able to kind of have that nuts and bolts, but also the side where you're dealing with experiencers and the caudate putainment, which is something that he came out with, which you're talking about intuition. So you're basically talking about psychic phenomenon, right? And a possible center in the brain where that could possibly be tracked. Mm-hmm. Again, he will state, he'll be the first to say it's a hypothesis, it's preliminary data, but it's being done. It's cutting edge work, and the implications of that are huge. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I would agree. I think Garry Nolan, Garry has emerged at such a critical juncture. I think it's amazing timing. that he's come forward more, and I love hearing about his kind of decision to do that. And it's incredible that even just in recent weeks, he's talked more about his own experiences with non-human entities and craft. In that recent documentary produced by Channel 7 Australia with Ross Coulthart, and Bryce Zabel was involved as well. I think that having people like him that are Nobel Prize nominees, that are such significant figures at significant institutions. You know, he's considered one of the best at one of the best American institutions for science. And so having somebody like that kind of lay it on the line after they already have their own lab, after they already have an endowed chair and things like that, it takes an enormous amount of you know, it takes an enormous amount of honesty and credibility and gumption and I'm just amazed at the guy. I'm amazed at the guy, and he's a really wonderful person to speak with as well. You know, having such a bright figure, and I think that there is something about what the position that Gary is at and how he explains himself, as James was talking about, as a teacher, as an educator, that makes him particularly vital at this moment. And also the fact that, you know, he has all these patents for what he's done, right? And so he's also an incredibly wealthy individual. You know, not many people know that, but he did that himself off of his own inventions, right? And that tends to shut people up as well. You know, all of these things tend to shut people up in different ways in terms of criticism and skepticism and things like that. And so, you know, if you're looking at somebody like Elizondo, who has so many admirable qualities, you know, there is a different swath of the public that is going to listen to a man like Gary than is going to listen to Lou. And they complement each other in many different ways. And so, you know, as we add voices to the choir, we get to see the credibility build within the topic and within the larger field of anomalous studies in general, I think.
Yeah, that's really well put as well. And Gary's backed up by a wonderful supporting cast behind him. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense at all, because it is. Mitch Horowitz, what will Mitch be bringing to the conversation? Jay, do you want to stick with you on this one?
Sure. Yeah, Mitch is an amazing award-winning author. You know, his books include Occult America, which is an amazing historical read on the spread of kind of spiritual seeking thinking and the understanding of the paranormal through the last 300 years in the United States. And he is also an editor, a longstanding editor of similar texts. And he's also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Time, Politico. But what he's bringing specifically to this conference is that he's going to do a 1-hour talk on the academic history of ESP studies and a way forward with academic ESP studies and the base that's already there. And I think that that is an incredibly helpful layer that we can put on this conversation. Mitch is a very powerful orator. He's an incredibly eloquent speaker. And I think that he can speak to the seriousness of academic inquiry and study within these wider fields and give voice to how we can really have a roadmap for the future. Wouldn't you say, James?
Yeah, totally. And again, I encourage anybody who maybe in the UFO conversation has not heard of Mitch Horowitz before. You're going to hear about him after this event for sure, included in the conversation, because I mean, if he's written wonderful books and he's given amazing talks, and he has a way of being such a clear and even down to earth communicator about these topics that seem kind of you know, again, occult or paranormal, you know, you could attach those kind of words to it, but when he speaks about it, it doesn't even really sound like it when he talks about it. It sounds like, oh yeah, I get it now. So, it's great to have Mitch participate in this event. And again, talking about kind of ESP research is right up the alley of the whole slide 9 conversation.
And James, will stick with you with Dr. Sean Esbjorn-Hargens. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that properly.
Yeah, Sean, I mean, it's incredible that we were able to have him participate. Jay could definitely speak more to Sean just because he's been a student in some of his classes and his courses. But I came across him actually a few years ago, and I was just blown away. He's somebody where after you hear him talk, you're going to say, like, why isn't this guy on like that UFO podcast, or even like, all the famous podcasts? Because he's such an intelligent dude, and he can speak to so many diverse topics, from psychic phenomenon to UFOs and contact and non-human intelligence in a pretty incredible way. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Sean Esbjorn-Hargens, I followed his work for quite a while. I took a 1-year course with him. He's also a dean of integral education and noetic sciences at the California Institute of Human Science. And there he has actually created a new program just within this last year, a trailblazing new program that's a PhD program as well as a master's program focusing purely on anomalous studies. It's a really unique situation within the United States. There are very few programs like this. You've got Jeff Kriples down in Texas. You've got Sean out in California. And other than that, it's few and far between. You have, lone wolves like Gary that kind of create an island within their community. And then you have people like Sean and Jeff that really try to create a larger umbrella on a program-wide scale to be able to let people have the academic shade over them to sit and work and really work on things for up to 7-8 years, on these situations within the academic framework, and then move on with a PhD. And so he's doing incredible work that way. I know that he's going to have a series of pretty amazing and eye-opening announcements that he's planning on making at the conference, which I'm really excited about, in terms of studies and in terms of published work that's going to be coming up. And that's going to be really cool. But I just love him. I love him as a thinker. He's really unique in terms of how he thinks about diagramming the phenomenon and really thinking about taxonomy and thinking about, like, okay, those are the grays, this is the hitchhiker phenomenon, and trying to figure out like a mental map for what all of this is. Because, there's often the tendency to kind of dumb things down and say it's all one thing or something like that. And he does a great job of really looking at the differences within particular aspects of anomalous studies and really pokes at those differences and uses them to try to create a larger framework for what we're really dealing with here. We have private conversations sometimes where it's like, we might be dealing with like a whole phone book worth of different kinds of entities and intelligences and things like this. We just don't know, but we have to start, writing out that phone book, right? We have to start delineating these differences, and he's taking that incredibly seriously at a program-wide level within an academic institution, and I think that should be applauded, and I look forward to more people knowing Sean's work in the future.
Well, since James called me out on that one, I'll get his details for Sean, and I'll reach out to him for after the conference, and we can hopefully do a follow-up. But that sounds really interesting, Jay. And I've mentioned on the podcast before, like, really crudely, like, I wonder if you could get whatever beings may be inside of a flying saucer and whichever beings may be inside of a black triangle, and be like, oh, do you know each other? And they might be like, nope. No idea who those guys are, and we just assume, oh yeah, they'll be coming from all different places, but you don't know. And are they even aware of each other? Does it matter to them that they are there, and do they even exist at the same time? Can they exist at the same time and place? So yeah, that's a really interesting conversation to bring up, so I look forward to hearing that one myself.
Absolutely.
Darren, also known as Exo Academian on Twitter, wonderful voice. I appreciate, obviously, from a podcasting point of view as well. Darren, I'll mention, because I feel being a podcaster too, I should give his shows a shout out. People will know Liminal Frames, sorry, which he was doing with Nathan, as people know as a wave soul from Calling All Beings as well. I'm shouting out all the podcast names now. That was on a little bit of a break, but it's coming back very soon, having a summer break. Also his own Point of Convergence podcast, which is very popular. Darren is a wonderful host, great thinker, great to hear him talk and discuss the UFO subject as well. And I know his recent episode with Nathan, I am sure, for Liminal Frames has just come back as well, talking about the landscape of podcasting, especially in terms of UFOs, social media, and where we kind of sit right now. And it's a really interesting, adult, mature conversation for anyone who might be thinking, oh, I don't want involved in the drama. It's not about that. It's a really intelligent conversation, and that's what you always get from someone like Darren. And James, I imagine Darren's conversation at the conference is going to be one that people should pay attention to as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Darren, or otherwise known as Exo Academian. I think, in as far as the podcasting world, when you're talking about things like UFOs, and especially when concerning subjects like consciousness and the nature of reality and integral thinking, Darren has such a great way of kind of like breaking things down and explaining them. It's like, each episode is like an essay, really. And he's covered a lot of different things on his Point of Convergence podcast. And I expect at the conference he's going to do something similar along those lines. And anytime that Darren covers a theme, I think after that conversation, even I've been involved in the research for almost 20 years, and I always come out with different perspectives and things I didn't know. So having Darren there to present and talk at this conference, I think, is kind of exactly along the lines of that theme of both cutting edge and being inclusive, while kind of being able to touch on such a wide spectrum of subjects. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I'm really excited about Darren joining us. He's just reached his 70th episode. He just published his 70th episode of Point of Convergence. And this is a guy who takes on such big topics every time he does an episode. He methodically writes out each one ahead of time. So he's basically reading like a 45-minute to an hour-long talk every time he publishes one of these things. And he's talking about things like, what's the fundamental nature of reality? What is time-space fundamental? Who are ultra-terrestrials and where are they? These incredibly huge and thorny topics that, you could take 2 of his episodes and that might be one person's whole career, like thinking about the nature of space-time or something like that. And I have to admire people like that really kind of swing for the fences intellectually within what they're trying to do. And I think it's amazing, and we're both honored that this is Darren's first public conference appearance doing a talk. Since kind of coming forward, it was just a few months ago that anybody knew what his face looked like, and that he told folks what his first name was, and that was on James's show, Engaging the Phenomenon, just a few months ago. And I'm sure the response to that was pretty wild, wasn't it, James?
Yeah, for sure. And it's notable that Darren, or Exo Academian, has gleaned some insight from attending the Monroe Institute event, where they were doing human initiated contact at the Monroe Institute, and utilizing all these contact modalities. So that he has that kind of to bring to the table, as well as some background and whatever he may have learned there.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, sorry, G, I cut you off there, but yeah, that is one to look forward to. Darren's wonderful, and like you say, it's nice to have the face to put to the name, because for a long time, God, I think it was well over a year ago, I think I reached out to Darren before he was known to say, would you want to come on the podcast sometime? And for obvious reasons, he was wanting to just stay in the background. But that's maybe one to get on in future if he'd do me the pleasure. And then finally, we've got Dr. Tim Grieve-Carlson, who wants to take that one for us, gents.
Well, maybe I'll start. I met Tim down at the Archives of the Impossible conference through Jeffrey Kripal. Tim Grieve-Carlson is kind of a star student of Jeff's. And for those that don't know Jeff Kripal's work, he's one of the most significant academics working in the United States. And he's a very key figure behind the scenes in terms of pushing forward the dialogue. He organizes a series of private conferences that I wouldn't want to even get into too far in terms of what he's doing there. But he's a really bright figure. And, you know, he did an amazing thing, Jeff, in terms of creating this new Archives of the Impossible at Rice, which has collected Jacques Vallée's archive, for example, Whitley Strieber, a lot of archival material from Whitley Strieber, collected things from NARCAP, from Leslie Kane, from the physical medium, Stuart Alexander. There are a lot of interesting folks that all of a sudden their documentation, all of their effects that they'd like to put forward, their writing will be kept and preserved for future generations of academics that might even take these subjects more seriously in the future than do now. And so that an academic institution like Rice was able to put serious money behind this effort is a big deal. And so they've started this series of conferences themselves from the academic framework. And Tim Grieve-Carlson both is a key figure in the archives themselves, in that he organized Jacques Vallée's quote unquote secret archive down at the Archives of the Impossible, which is not going to be revealed until about 2027, I believe. And he also helped put together the conference and other people's effects down at the archives. So he's a significant figure in terms of what he's been kind of doing in terms of the grunt work of putting together like Vallée's archive. And at the same time, he's a brilliant speaker, incredible. And he has a book that's going to come out very soon that's about early anomalous phenomena that was encountered by the American settlers and how it was recorded at the time, how it was processed at the time, and what people thought about it at the time. And so it will really augment the work of, say, like Wonders in the Sky, the Chris Aubeck, Jacques Vallée text, and things like that, or situations like even in American Cosmic, where Diana Pasulka was talking about anomalous phenomena situations that were happening centuries ago. And so Tim is going to be key in that movement in terms of like fleshing out the history. And he's also going to be delivering a new talk for the conference that creates a contemporary framework for how to look back at those historical cases of ecology and environmental phenomena and anomalies and how we process them. And, you know, he's another guy that swings for the fences, and I'm excited to see what he has to say. James?
Yeah, I'm really honored that he decided to participate in this event with us. And again, I think he's going to be somebody where, you know, he may not be very well known now in the UFO community, so to speak, but I think he will definitely become a more prominent voice and researcher. And, you know, I'm glad that, you know, we can have this conference and put him out there, so to speak, in a way where he can talk about this in the framework of the UFO phenomenon. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful group you've put together, especially for a first attempt at a conference, let alone if this was your 10th and you were seasoned hosts of these types of events, which I'm sure you'll grow to be. And I'll definitely try and get to the second or third, I promised. What I would like to know though is, on a recent update you shared on your own channel, James, it was Jay himself said he couldn't say too much, but you mentioned that not only would someone in person attending get a seat in the room, but potentially there would be some other interesting names in the room as well buying tickets. Now, I'm not necessarily asking you to name who else will be there, but let's expand on it a little bit. What types of folks are you expecting to turn up?
Oh wow, that's a tough one, Andy.
It is.
That's a tough one. I mean, yeah, I think that there's going to be people that are attending the event who people will know by name for sure. That's I really don't want to put anybody out there for, that's kind of at their own decision.
Yeah. Put it this way, if you've been following this field for a while, you're going to know a lot of people in the audience. Again, this is a very small room. It's a very intimate situation. And it's important to note that at this point, for your listeners, as kind of a public service announcement, we have 19 tickets remaining for live in person. 19. So if you hear this podcast, jump on the link if you're interested in coming out, no matter where you are, in New York, if you're on the East Coast, wherever. If you'd like to join us, please feel free. And if you'd like to join online, we have plenty of room for you and we'd love to have you. But, there are going to be people in the audience. We could probably make 3 other conferences just based on some of the people that are going to be showing up that day. And when people actually see who's there, that's not going to seem like an oversell at all, I don't think. James?
Yeah, I agree. And again, I'm very careful what I want to say, who's coming and things like that. But yeah, absolutely right. I mean, the part, the people that are going to be in attendance, that would be a conference within itself.
And I think when you get to attend these conferences, I'm very fortunate. I'll be hosting Awakening in Manchester on October 16th. For anyone who's attending that in the UK, that's got Whitley Strieber, Richard Doty, Mike Barra, and Steve Mera, which is probably a very different conference to what you gents are hosting here. It's a different aspect to the UFO conversation and associated phenomena as well. But when you attend these conferences, the thing I enjoy the most, I think, is meeting and talking to the other people who are attending with you. That's not to say that you've got Chris Mellon and Louis Elizondo sat either side of you, nudging you now and again, going, "That was wonderful, that presentation, wasn't it?" And that's not a clue at who's attending, folks. I'm just picking 2 names out of the ether. But it's getting to talk to like-minded individuals, meet people face to face, meet new friends, hear new ideas, discussions as you have those breaks between the talks, the bar afterwards, as people start to have a couple of drinks and, share new ideas. And that's really, like you say, Jay, having COVID and all of that wiping out kind of a year and a half or 2 years of us getting together. I think people maybe appreciate these a little bit more. And that's why I kind of look forward to with these conferences starting back up. And I think this is what a conference like this can certainly contribute. Obviously, I won't ask you to go into more detail or share initials or give us a clue. Does it rhyme with Dob Lazar or anything? But, but yeah, I think even by the time this podcast goes out, those 19 tickets will likely be gone. But if people should check anyway, I'm going to share straight away on social media once we finish recording again to say, here's a link, 19 tickets remaining, folks, get them before they're gone. And I'll be joining the virtual event online, like I hope many, many others do as well. One more thing I want to get to before listener questions was there was a conversation, a little bit of a heated debate between a couple of very well-known and respected podcasters off the back of something, Jay, I know you had said, and this was to do with experiencers reporting their abductions to the police. I actually brought this topic up earlier today, literally hours ago, with someone who has no interest in the UFO topic, just a friend, and they're very high level with any kind of interest and very much on the side of not really believing unless they see it themselves. And they actually have a question for you both later on as well in listener questions. But I mentioned that it was going between a few people. Should experiencers report abductions to the police? And I know this was a conversation that went back and forward, and I thought it was a really interesting take on how does that conversation even go? Because I can see both sides. I can see the for and against. And Jay, I think you had mentioned that you were very much for if someone has had that sort of experience reporting it.
Well, in my it's a very tricky subject, and I think that this is one of these situations where what people should maybe do right now might be a little bit different from if somebody's listening to this 2 years on, in even just a few years, there might be better workflows for how to report, and there might be better strategies, and there might be less stigma, and we hope more normalized conversations along these topics than there are now. But it's a very challenging and tricky subject, right? Because if you see something in the sky and you call it in and report it, that seems like it's one thing. If you were to call into your local police department and say that there are, beings in your home or something like that, depending on who's on the other end of the phone, they might perceive that in a very different way than many people in our community might even, and even within our community, it's a hot topic, right? People are okay with there being like these mysterious futuristic looking crafts in the sky, but there are people that inwardly have a lot of challenging, conflicting issues about whether there's actually a being in one of those crafts or not, right?
Yeah.
And being able to broach that conversation and being able to say like, okay, like, look, people see things, people see entities, people see and we depend on people to say that they've seen these things, right? Craft, beings, anything. If you see something, say something, right? It's important. The whole field depends on people making reports. If we didn't have those reports, we'd have nothing to go on within this community. And so, that creates a base. It creates a base in a situation where we need to respect the people that are making these reports on a very basic level. We need to make it okay to be able to make these reports. And people can say like, I don't know about this, I don't know about that. But it's important to have a clear and respectful line of communication by which people can make reports. At the same time, in places like the United States, it's varied in terms of, who you're going to get if you call the police, right? And I'm right now, and I'm in Virginia. I'm near Virginia Beach today. Earlier today, I was in Jersey City. I might get a very different police officer on the other end of the phone, and you could find yourself in a situation. I've talked to experiencers that they worry if they make reports whether they're going to lose their kids, because they're all of a sudden they're going to be in this flow with kind of the community framework where somebody makes a report and then it gets funneled over to Child Protective Services or something like that, God forbid, and somebody might lose custody of their own children because they make a report, right?
Yep.
And so we're in this strange kind of Wild West landscape still with regard to these issues. It's one of the main reasons why, the language and the new funding bills in Congress and things like that couldn't come soon enough, because we need to normalize these conversations and we need to destigmatize these topics so that people can safely talk about these, even with people in positions of authority like the police, without wondering whether there are going to be negative repercussions for them. What do you think, James?
Can I just, because James is going to come in and say something really intelligent here, so but I'll ruin it before that.
No.
What got me thinking to bring this up as well was it's to see that conversation together about potential experiences / abductions, whatever that may be, conscious or not, with reporting something to the police is just such a while. It brings it back to reality as we know it, that you report that to the police. But you mentioned a Dr. Sean Esbjorn-Hargens who has these diagrams and creates those links between, okay, here's one phenomena, here's another phenomena. And as you go out that diagram, the phenomena is going to wildly vary as to what people can believe, what they choose to believe, what in their own heads they can rationalize as being realistic, and then it was too extreme or too woo, as some people like to say. And I just think, looking at the cast of speakers that you have, some of these are all of these people can draw those lines between, like you say, okay, people are reporting a craft in the sky, but I've just done a deep dive on the Phoenix Lights. People reported the Phoenix Lights. Is it taken seriously? Was it taken seriously? No, it wasn't. And we know that. How do you get to that point, like you say, of I've had an experience? Is it a criminal act? Should I report it? And who do I report it to? And I think you're right that you say in a couple of years' time, that landscape could look very different as to how and when maybe not necessarily experiences or abductees can report to the police, but there would be something there. A Garry Nolan with the work he's doing, talking about various types of phenomena, is still, for all Gary's being very outspoken and a wonderful speaker, he still, I think, knows cleverly where to draw that line right now for that mainstream perception. And you just have to keep towing forward over the line more and more each time. And we've seen that with other speakers in the last couple of years as well, where they say more and more as time goes on. But it was a fascinating idea of a discussion, and God, you could do a whole podcast discussion on that. That's one for Darren, no doubt, as well, for one of his essays for 2 hours to dive into. But James, what's your thoughts on how do we get to that point where we have experiencers potentially reporting abductions, not just to the police, but having them taken seriously as well?
Yeah, I think, Jay was exactly right in what he said, that like the current infrastructure, I don't think is even prepared for that, unfortunately. And, and that's part of the issue with the lack of transparency over the last 80 or 90 years with this issue. If there wasn't an embargo, we may not, these type of issues may have already, had been resolved. There might have been an infrastructure for people to be taken seriously, heard, and not criticized or have to fear for their job, or, like Jay said, custody. I know when I had experiences, there's no way I was going to report that to anybody, not even MUFON, in my opinion, because I was just like, you're questioning yourself hard enough. Forget about what an institution who thinks that this subject is kind of for like crazy people in a sense. And now that stigma has greatly diminished thanks to Dr. Garry Nolan, Lil Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, and the dozens of people who have been working in the background to make this a serious topic. And actually, I have a friend, people might know him. His name is Daniel Ingram, and he's been working on a project called the Emergent Phenomena Research Consortium, EPRC. And it's geared more towards awakening and meditative and peak experiences, but the kind of idea of contact with non-human intelligence or entities is something that actually happens to people when they're just doing deep meditation or what have you. And what he's trying to do with the EPRC is create infrastructure so when somebody has even an awakening experience or an experience like this with a non-human intelligence, where you can actually go to somebody who's experienced, talk to them, and they are trying to do science with it as well. So not only is it going to be documented, and they're going to try to, you can do EEG scans and different things to try to track some of these experiences and see what more you can find out. And better yet, because he was an emergency room trauma doctor, to get this stuff not only taken seriously, but put into medical codes so you can bill it on your insurance, right? And as Daniel said, experiences like this are scaling. There's only more happening. And as this kind of, because if you looked at everybody right now and like on a broad spectrum, you'd have no idea who's an experiencer, because so many people keep it to themselves. They don't even tell their friends or spouses. And I guarantee you, as this topic becomes more open and less stigmatized and, basically officially acknowledged, you're gonna hear from a lot more people who've had experiences. So again, the infrastructure is needed. I really don't think it's there yet, but you need the infrastructure and you need resources. And, thankfully, I do think that we are headed in a situation where this is going to be taken more seriously, and you are going to be able to credibly go to somebody to make a report, whether it be the police, whether there's a special person within psychology or medical field where there's going to be a department for something like that. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, But again, I think that's in time to come. Again, and as I said, personally, I've never reported any of the experiences would have, because I never wanted to be criticized or looked at as crazy, unfortunately.
And we've discussed the experiences at a very base level, but if people want to hear more of both your stories, you discuss them both on your own podcast ad nauseum too. I both interviewed both of you one-to-one, and you laid out things wonderfully on those, and people I would encourage to go back and listen to those so we're not treading over that ground. And I've got a few questions to finish up with. The first one is from that friend of mine, Sean, and this comes from a place of, and I thought it'd be nice to ask a question from a listener who doesn't really have an interest in UFOs. And when I had the conversation about that, I said, what would you ask to gents who say they have a story to tell and have had experiences? And I didn't even go into the detail of your experiences. And he looked and he was like, I'd like to know. And he was like, really honestly, how do you not necessarily convince others, but how do you convince yourself that these aren't really vivid dreams that people have? And he used the example of having such a vivid dream one night, he thought he'd lost money in his home, but remembered where it was. And he woke up the next day and actually went to check. And he was like, oh, no, I haven't. The money's not there. And he wants to know, and I think it's a fair question. What is it individually you can say to yourself, this happened to me, and this is why I know this was a real event?
Yeah, so that's that is a great question. And it's going to be different for everybody in some regard. I mean, you want to be self-critical, but a lot of people who are experiencers, or even people who have a sighting, tend to doubt themselves, almost so unconsciously, like they want to, kind of not pretend it never happened, but it's, what kind of trouble that put you in a sense of like, now you have to explain this to somebody or something. And kind of like, if you can't prove it, it's really hard. And for a lot of experiencers, it takes them years to come out and talk openly, or even with somebody close to them, about an experience like this. Fortunately, I would say, I guess for people like me and Jay, was we've had experiences where other people were involved. So for me, that is a blessing, I guess, because my family were witness to some, pretty incredible events. But if you don't have that, you have to have the courage to do it if you're going to talk about it. And yes, you do have to be self-critical to an extent. And I would say, use the process of elimination, and see, are there things that could kind of explain what had happened, and just take note of it, because it could be so difficult to even for yourself to say this happened and come to grips with that, right? Because once you make that step and even admit to yourself that this happened to me, it changes everything, because there's no going back at that point. So what do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I was really blessed in many ways that I've had many instances where other people were around me when anomalous experiences happened in different modalities. As people that regularly listen to that UFO podcast would know, I grew up in a haunted, what is often referred to as a haunted house. I've had interactions with non-human entities. And thankfully, many of these situations happened around other people. Most people, it's not like that. And, one of the reasons why people even know who I am is that behind the scenes, I was a confidential source about these things. And one of the reasons people listened to me to begin with is because I had many, many people that were able to back me up that didn't even know each other about various situations. And so, that tends to perk up people's ears. And so that's, for example, why one of the reasons why Ralph Blumenthal wrote about me last year in that debrief article that was originally slated for the New York Times. Now, a lot of people don't have that situation. They don't have that, they don't have that to go off of. They might have a situation that only lasts like 2 minutes of their life, and it's by themselves, and nobody else was around. They only had their own experience, and it shifts their framework for the nature of reality for many years to come. And then what do they do with that? And I think that that's a bigger question in and of itself, which I think addresses what your friend was coming at it with, is like, what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? And I think to a large degree, we only have our senses. We have our senses to work with, and we do the best we can with the senses that we have. And we could even have a incredibly impactful dream, right? Like you were talking about with your friend. And that can actually affect how you process and how you think about your life. And in fact, a lot of people think that that's what dreams are for, right? We have these dreams so that we can kind of process and message things to ourselves differently on different levels, right? And so one thing that I would suggest is that, regardless of whether you can find a fundamental objective truth to your own personal experience, try to take in that experience happened to you in a sensory way, and think about how it's impacted you, and think about, like, how do you process that? How do we retroactively kind of invest in processing and integrating that into what your emotional development is going to be like through the rest of your life, and how you're going to treat other people about that, and how you're going to treat yourself about it. Because a lot of times people have like self-worth issues, like, am I going crazy? Like, this shouldn't have happened to me. There's a lot of kind of self-hatred that can happen, honestly, with people when they're dealing with these subjects. And so as much as it becomes about, to a lot of people in the kind of general popular culture aspect, people think about like, well, how can they prove that to me? Such a bigger thing is like, how do you prove that to yourself? And I think the biggest thing is like, well, how did that impact you? And what can you take from that to move forward?
There's some good advice there for people too who may want to share their stories. And obviously there's the experiencer group. The links will be in the description if folks want to reach out and just talk to someone. Regularly, I get contacted by folks who say they don't want to be on the podcast, they don't want their names read out, but I've had an experience and I've never told anyone, or I've seen something and I don't know what it is. And I think that's just a nice first step to reach out to someone you trust and just have that conversation. And people like yourselves are there as well. Last couple of questions with the time I've got remaining. Keeping on that theme of entities, and you've discussed this both before as well, from Barry. He wants to know, when you've had interactions with various entities like praying mantids, have you ever got a different vibe off of different types of entities, i.e. greys to mantids or vice versa, or others?
For me, I haven't had a personal interaction with the mantids, but definitely a spectrum of phenomena. And I will say, for me, 1,000,000% yes. There were different kinds of encounters I had, and it seemed obvious that it was a different intelligence. And I know this is a huge question, right? Is it one phenomenon posing as several phenomena? And Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia has that, the imagery that kind of demonstrates this kind of meta intelligence or super intelligence that's working through a myriad of kind of masks, so to speak. And I don't know what the ultimate answer is to that, but personally, when I've had different interactions, what looked differently, the feel was very distinct. Definitely 1,000,000% for me, yes.
And Jay?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. Different entities tend to communicate differently. They tend to interact differently, and I've seen that. I've heard many reports of others that way. But if we're talking about praying mantis-like beings or greys, yeah, they communicate very differently, and it's a challenging thing to convey to the general audience. But one thing is about kind of cadence and language, and there are differences in how even telepathic communication can come across. And what is often the case is that gray beings tend to communicate in kind of a line by line way that's almost like a text message, almost like just verbiage coming in a very almost kind of computer-like way. And say mantis beings, from reports and from personal experience, we're more talking about these kind of like nests of visual imagery and words. And they tend to unfold in the mind in a really, really interesting way. It's almost more like a series of haikus. It's almost as if you're getting a haiku in your mind that's mixed with a GIF or two. So you might see like a physical action in your mind's eye, as well as a couple lines of text. Most of the articles are taken out. Those kinds of beings don't use words like the, and, or, things like that. They're using more like verbs and nouns and adjectives,
Sure.
Mixed with visuals to communicate with us anyway. And it's fascinating. And towards James' point, there's the idea, like Jacques Vallée, where how many of these beings could possibly be morphing to appear differently to us for the sake of deception, or for the sake of making us more comfortable, or whatever the case may be, right? And at the same time, when somebody encounters these things, it's almost like if you were to encounter a cat, and then you were to encounter a child, and then you were to encounter a dog, and you're like, all three of those interacted with me very, very differently, and they clearly could not have costumed as another of those, right?
Sure.
A kid can't impersonate a dog very well. They can. It'll be cute, but will it be accurate? Probably not.
Yeah.
Right. And so along similar lines, is it possible that some of those beings could masquerade as each other? Absolutely. And at the same time, it would almost be as if, James or I were to act not only as if we were fluid Chinese speakers, but we were also kind of speaking in a backwards and ancient dialect of Chinese rather than English or something like that. And that's at its most base a reflection of the kind of differentiation that can happen here. You're clearly looking at a mind that maps things quite differently in many of these cases.
And a final question from longtime contributor Dave Smethurst. Hi to Dave. Do James and Jay think we're seeing a bigger emphasis on the experiencer element of the phenomenon lately, particularly as more people like Garry Nolan are openly discussing their experiences? Jay, will we kick off with you, then finish with James?
I think that experiencers, when people talk about our experiencers coming into more play, I think another way to frame that is, are people treating them with the respect they deserve, or the kind of or are they looking at them in a more objective and understanding framework? Because the reality is that experiencers are the absolute base of this whole field. And from my perspective, and I think on a relatively objective framework, you don't have a field of ufology if you don't have experiencers. What you have is a series of reports and people trying to map that out and put something together. Even if you're talking about David Fravor or whoever else that's coming at things from a governmental or military framework, you're still eventually getting to a person that's in some form of authority or non-authority. You're dealing with a civilian, or you're dealing with somebody that's not a civilian that had a situation, and then they decided to write about it or talk about it in whatever way they did. And if it wasn't for those people, there would be nothing. There would be absolutely nothing in terms of like the conversations that we're having, because as skeptics of the community often state, we don't have enough physical proof. So it comes down to so much within the what we have from experiencer cases. And so when I hear, are we listening to the experiencers more? I hope so. And I hope that, like John Keel hoped, say 50 years ago, that what we're hearing is an unedited version of what those experiencers had. Because for too long, researchers would shave off details that they found inconvenient or thought would be hard to believe. And, that went back so far that, we see drawings of gray aliens that are wearing like belts and boots and stuff like that from the early days. And then we hear more accounts and they're like, oh, they usually just kind of seem like they're naked. But even at a certain time, that was hard to believe, that you'd see a being that was that different coming out of a craft and they were just, bald ass naked, right? Or they were naked. And that was so hard to believe that people would shift their own narrative to accommodate the situation, where some of these beings would be wearing clothes or different clothes and things like that. And so I think from my perspective, what I want to hear more is the unedited accounts. And I would like to hear more researchers finding those points where they start to feel uncomfortable because those details don't necessarily map out or match up with what they think is supposed to be happening, and then lead with that. Lead into the areas of the inconvenient truths, because people like Hal Puthoff will tell us over and over and over again that the cases that don't make sense and the cases that have the strangest aspects to try to put together are often the ones that we can learn from the most.
James?
Yeah, and kind of to magnetize what Jay is saying about experiencers and the study of UFOs, is that even if somebody has a sighting, that is an experience of sorts. Whether they got a telepathic message or download or not, that seeing that object and knowing that it's not something, or even thinking it's not something from here, has a huge impact. So I just want to kind of state that from the get-go. But I think what we're seeing now is, I don't think it was like this was like necessarily planned and phased in, so to speak. Yeah. So I think what we're seeing here is like an organic blossoming of the conversation right now in regards to everything that's going on, where you have people like Jim Semivan, who was really high up in the CIA for many years, openly talking about his experiences, and people like Dr.Garry Nolan, again, somebody who's a Nobel nominee, and brilliant scientist, coming out as an experiencer and sharing some of the details of his experiences. And I think that it's occurring now because the momentum is there. The destigma, it's destigmatized to the extent where people feel more comfortable and encouraged to maybe share some of their experiences. So I do think that it is, again, a natural evolution of the conversation to where people feel more comfortable nowadays with the stigma more at bay and diminishing, where people are, open to sharing their experiences more. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing happen.
And gents, that is pretty much us for time. What I'd like to ask, though, just for a final pitch to the listeners, not that you need to sell it any more than you already have. It's looking a wonderful event. I think the quality of the speakers speak for themselves. Again, apologies, I've not mentioned them enough, but not just yourselves as hosts, but the wonderful Priscilla Stone of Quantum Witch Cafe and Kelly Chase of UFO Rabbit Hole Podcast are both helping with hosting duties as well. Your final thoughts on what people can expect if they either turn up in person or if they sign into the virtual event.
Yeah, I mean, again, the in-person event is going to be very intimate. It's only about 140 people at this event in a very beautiful space. So I think that people who go in person are going to definitely be able to speak to the participants, but also the different people attending there, and they'll have an opportunity to network and make those connections and actually see people in person. Again, for people who are tuning in from the live stream, I can't emphasize enough. This is an event that I would want to go to. This is an event that I would want to attend, because of the people speaking there, right? Dr. Garry Nolan, of course, has really been leading the conversation now, and it's an honor to have him there as well as everybody else. So again, I think it's going to be very inclusive and cutting edge. And I don't want to like toot our own horns, but I really think that what we're bringing here with this conference and event is where the conversation is beginning to go, and where it will be going for the years to come.
Yeah, I completely agree with James. I think for those that might be thinking about attending virtually, what James and I are trying to do here, and I think we were having a conversation, Andy, before we got into the recording zone here today, about like looking at the future of events within our field. And I think we recognize that people like ourselves have been making moves within this field. We've been having conversations with others. We've been making important connections, and that it's important for the field of these conferences and in-person events to evolve, to match the level of integrity and intellectual rigor that we've been encouraging within this community. I think that's incredibly important. And just as far as a generational thing goes, we see conferences often happen, and we kind of graft our enthusiasm into a situation that might be kind of more in the general kind of ancient aliens framework of the field or something like that. And that can be totally okay. People that'll be there that day at our conference have appeared on shows like that for sure. And that's totally cool. But, in a situation like this, it's important, I think, to kind of vote with your interest in terms of like the kinds of conversations that you want to see in this field in the future, and the kinds of conversations, the kind of networking, the kinds of moves that people can kind of push forward to grow the community and grow the conversation and create leading edge situations. So for those of you that are listening out there virtually, that might be interested in a virtual ticket, what we're going to be creating is a very intimate situation. And not only will you be able to watch it live, you'll have an archival recording afterwards. And that's significant. And I think what you'll see is a quality of congeniality and forward level thinking that is rare in these kinds of public conversations. People are used to having a shtick in conferences, and people are used to going out and kind of like doing their thing or something like this. And we intentionally chose people that are consistently looking at the field in such a way that they're constantly trying to flip things over and look at things from a fresh approach. And we think that kind of energy is going to really come across in this very intimate event. So if you're interested, we have limited tickets, 19 live in-person tickets, and we have about 700, I think, left virtually, something like that. And so please get out there as soon as humanly possible. I'm sure Andy will put links in the description, and we'll create a code for that UFO podcast folks to be able to get those tickets. So thank you all so much.
Awesome. And thank you both. And those virtual tickets are limited, folks, because you could just put out an unlimited amount, but to limit it gives you the optimal bandwidth, performance, and presentation as well for watching it virtually. So I wish you all the best with this event, and I genuinely mean I would love to have been there. Next time I'll do my very best. The event is called An Inquiry into Anomalous Experiences and the Phenomenon. Links are in the description. The event takes place October 8th in New York City at the Helen Mills Theatre. James and Jay, thank you both very much, and best of luck with the upcoming event.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Andy, it's an absolute pleasure to be on the show again. Thank you so much for making the time. Deeply appreciated.
Folks, at the start of this year, I got a bit of a health scare, and it kick-started me to getting fitter, healthier, and generally looking after myself better. A healthier breakfast was high on my priority list, and it should be for you too. Magic Spoon is the perfect way to get in your morning protein, eating cereal that tastes like it did when you were a kid without all the bad stuff. I can promise you there is nothing unidentified in this cereal. The variety pack has 4 flavours including cocoa, fruity, frosted and peanut butter. This pack has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein and only 4 net grams of carbs. There are only 140 calories per serving. It's keto friendly, gluten free, grain free, soy free and low carb. It's delicious but super healthy cereal that really brings joy to your mornings, afternoons or actually any time of day. Go to magicspoon.com/thatUFO to grab a variety pack and try it today. Be sure to use our promo code THATUFO at checkout to save $5 off your order. Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee, so if for any reason you don't like it, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to get your delicious bowl of guilt-free cereal at magicspoon.com/thatUFO and use that code THATUFO to save $5 off. Thank you Magic Spoon for sponsoring this episode. That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/thatUFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO Podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFOUAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little around. Meditative gamma state full on meta. You can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. I called out to my boys, they thought this was noise, they thought it was a dream, they thought it was my toys, they thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what it is because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? But for being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes.